It's time to start the second part of the plenary. The title is the same, Arctic Council Observers, the Near Arctic and the High North. The first presentation is on a natural experiment in Arctic awareness, media coverage and the 2013 Arctic Council Ministerial Meeting, and we have a trio here. Led by Professor Philip Steinberg. He's a professor of political geography at Durham University, UK, and also the director of IPRU, which is a famous institute on border research. And with him here we have his PhD candidates, Ingrid Medby and Johanne Brun. Please, you have 50 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Lassie. In some sense, this paper actually picks up from a theme from yesterday's session where we talked about what does it mean to be an Arctic nation and how do various nations phrase themselves as, or position themselves as Arctic nations, as non-Arctic nations with an interest in the Arctic, etc. And so what we're doing in this paper in our 15 minutes is talking about how, in particular, the Kiruna Arctic Ministerial Meeting was covered in the media of the various countries, the candidate states, the member states, and the existing observer states. Background on the Arctic Council, probably don't need to go through this for people in this room. The 8 member states, 6 permanent participants, 26 permanent observers, in particular the 6 permanent observer states. We'll be talking about. This chart bears an interesting resemblance to some of the charts that Jakub showed yesterday from the Russian media. Instead of actually coverage of the Arctic, this is coverage of the Arctic Council in the Nexus database of about 552, mostly English language news sources. And what we see is probably not a surprise to most of us, is for much of the Arctic Council's history, the Arctic and the Arctic Council was relatively obscure. Did not get much attention in the media around the world. We see an interesting little spike kind of in 2004. That was the release of the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, which then led to quite a few articles discussing the Arctic Council. Then a lull from 2007 with the flag planting and the Northwest Passage being ice-free and Ilulissat Declaration, yet various events coming up. But then this huge spike happens in 2013. And of course, what happened in 2013 was the ministerial meeting in Kiruna, Sweden, which for various reasons attracted all kinds of news attention that had not been directed to the Arctic Council previously. For one thing, of course, there was the signing of the Marine Oil Prevention Agreement, which attracted attention in itself, but then also because of Greenpeace claiming that it did not provide enough long-term protections for the Arctic environment. In addition, there was Greenland's boycott of the meeting because of its position vis-a-vis the Danish delegation. And then, of course, something we've already been talking about today, the whole controversy over the admission of various permanent observer candidates, including probably most notably China and to a lesser extent other Asian nations, which then fit into all sorts of concern about, or at least recognition of Asia, and in particular China's growing economic and political power on the world stage. There was also quite a bit of controversy and news about Greenpeace's quest for admission to the Council, and then, as we've already discussed quite a bit today, controversy surrounding the European Union as well. So for all these reasons, and this is really what interests us, is, and of course there's a lot of debate about each of these particular candidates, and around more broadly the issue of whether or not more entities should be allowed into the Arctic Council and what that means for the future of the Arctic Council, for Arctic governance, etc. But that's really not where we're focusing our paper. What's interesting to us is that suddenly, because of all this controversy, the Arctic Council just kind of burst on the world stage as something that effectively newspapers had to write about, because it was a big story, which meant suddenly news organizations around the world had to explain the Arctic to their people, and they had to explain Arctic governance issues and the Arctic Council. and all these kinds of things, which is why we see the Arctic Council meeting as kind of a natural experiment. Effectively, it was like, sort of a big focus group, except we didn't have to put them together. It just happened. Suddenly, national and regional media in all three categories of countries, member states, candidate states, observer states, were forced to articulate their country's relationship to the Arctic and also what it meant for other countries to be involved in the Arctic. In other words, what does it mean to be Arctic? What is the Arctic? Why does it matter? Looking at media coverage has its own complications, but has a lot of advantages as well. The media has a crucial role in shaping and reflecting debate. It translates political understandings between politicians and the populace, and the traffic goes in both directions. It normalizes political geographies. It establishes a way of thinking of the world, and in particular for a diplomatic event, which by definition is not attended by the vast majority of the people in a country, media coverage has a very specific role in translating, between sort of our past understandings of places, how we understand places in our history, our identities, etc., and then carrying that on to explaining a contemporary present event, and then projecting onward into the future. Because, of course, a diplomatic meeting is very much about creating a framework for then understanding and working toward new cooperative futures. So that's why we see kind of this coverage of the meeting as kind of a microcosm of the way in which the Arctic is being worked out in the policy arena. So I'm not going to go deep into the method of all this, but very briefly, we altogether collected and translated 280 news stories from around the world, 157 from the member states, 91 from the observer candidates, and 32 from the existing observer states. And Johanna will tell us about what we found.
So coverage from the 8 member states tended to follow 2 principal narratives, and the first one is characterized by a sense of northern protectionism, and that was mainly associated with the Canadian and the Russian coverage. And the main directive of this narrative is that the Arctic is national territory, and that states geographically external to the region are not legitimate Arctic stakeholders. So the Canadian coverage supported this idea by mobilizing their indigenous population to construct sort of a hierarchy of Arcticness, which is in fact quite typical for Canada's Arctic political discourse. For example, newspapers would emphasize how Canada was represented by Aglukak, who is Inuk and thus a real northerner. Russian coverage, somewhat less diplomatically, dismissed any legitimacy of particularly the Asian interests by outright stating that these countries are hidden snakes following devious paths and camouflaging true interests. The visual assemblage of this coverage was in itself quite telling. So in addition to images like these ones of Chinese explorers, and of course they were never Italian, especially the Russian coverage would use maps like this one, which shows the sectoral division of the Arctic, which is a principle that has been abandoned for quite a while now. But sort of conveniently, it shows no sort of gaps where other states might rightfully enter. So by contrast, the US coverage used maps like this one, which shows a large international zone. This brings me to the next narrative, which emphasized sort of global interconnectedness and was mostly connected to the Nordic countries and the US. So a series of issues associated with an Arctic melt, such as rising sea levels and global food production, were framed as reasons for the legitimate interests of extraterritorial agents. So rather than just being sort of a national space of commerce, the Arctic was seen as sort of a global climate laboratory that would bring nations together. This is in direct opposition to much of the Russian coverage, which predicted the eruption of World War III and the emergence of Chinarctica. Well, yeah. Unsurprisingly, security was, however, also a concern of the US. But the Nordic newspapers also displayed some concern. So, for example, a Finnish newspaper noted that, I quote, "It is important to be active now and in the future so that the situation would never come to a point where missiles would be flying over Lapland." Oh, that's a quote. So in the candidate states, journalists had to explain why their governments had deemed it necessary to be involved in this region, which was quite far away. So in doing so, the media framed the Arctic as a space which was naturally becoming internationally important due to the melting of the ice cap. So like the Nordic states, the candidate states tended to emphasize climate research and of course resource extraction. But global shipping was also a dominant theme throughout, because 4 of the candidate states are, of course, major shipping nations. So these candidate states emphasized their individual role and expertise as globally important shipping nations as reasons why they belonged at the Arctic negotiation table. Finally, the candidate states saw it as important to simply be present for a number of reasons. Firstly, the Arctic was seen as an emergent stage of high-level diplomacy, which reached far beyond its geographical borders. So the Arctic Council was, for example, by one Italian newspaper called the North Pole's G8. Secondly, as other states were seen to be racing towards what a Chinese newspaper called the Earth's last treasure trove, it would be important to sort of keep an eye on them, both for the sake of business, but also for the sake of the environment. Finally, the pre-existing observer states generally relied on a high politics framing of the Arctic, in which sort of rising Asian powers, and Italy, of course, were seeking to sort of establish themselves in the Arctic. This coverage broadly adopted either a suspicious stance toward Asian interest in the Arctic or a sympathetic one, which was sort of understanding towards the applicant states' interest in climate research, global shipping, and resource extraction. A particularly interesting aspect of this coverage was the framing of the Arctic as a region like any other, which doesn't sound very interesting, but this sort of conveniently avoids unpleasant questions regarding the legitimacy of the status of pre-existing European observer states, because this is not seen as about legitimacy per se, but about having been successful politically and diplomatically.
So what emerged from these 280 stories then was a seemingly diverse range of ways of explaining the Arctic's significance to us, to them, and to the world at large. And so it provided an illustrative case, or as we have called it, a natural experiment of Arctic awareness in media across the world. Journalists in the 8 member states, 6 candidate states, and 6 existing observer states shared some discursive strategies, topics, understandings, but also differed in some. They all caught their audience's attention with hyperbolic headlines, such as talking about races, scrambles, even ice wars. And very often these populist notions of geopolitical rivalry was linked to China's growing presence in the Arctic. They also all focus on hot topics such as future opportunities, such as shipping or natural resources, and future challenges such as climate change and competition. As Johanna has just told us, for journalists in the 8 member states, this prompted a question of whether to adopt an inclusive or an exclusive approach. On the one hand, the increased interest from states across the world could mean avenues for international cooperation, especially with so-called great powers. But on the other hand, it could also necessitate protection from these very same powers and their insatiable demands. Journalists in the 6 candidate states framed the Arctic as important for many of the same opportunities and challenges it might present, but it was linked to sort of wider global interest. And this same threat of unsustainable exploitation was seen as a reason for why extra-regional involvement was necessary. And furthermore, the political presence of other states, also other non-Arctic states, was seen as a reason for them having to position themselves for the future. Lastly, the 6 observer states sort of skirted the question of legitimacy in relation to geographic proximity, thereby avoiding the somewhat uncomfortable question of why they had observer status to begin with. And rather, journalists framed the Arctic as now reflecting a wider global geopolitical game, and the Arctic playing host to high-level politics far beyond latitudinal borders. And so these seemingly divergent framings of the Arctic's importance all shared the common understanding of the Arctic as important, not so much for what it is, but for what it may become. Whether for the opportunities it may offer or the challenges it might present, the Arctic was consistently scripted as a region for states and stakeholders to position themselves in anticipation of future developments. And in that way, the importance of the Arctic was seen as transcending the potential for material gains or material losses, and rather understood as mattering for the symbolic significance of political presence. And as the reporters across the world celebrated or dreaded so-called Arctic openings, the news reporters themselves partook in the discursive construction of the Arctic as a space of global significance. And in this way, the Kiruna meeting in 2013 was an unprecedented news event, not so much for the ministerial decisions per se, but because of the level of global attention it received. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip, Johan, and Ingrid. Then the next presentation is on China Looks North, Emerging Arctic Diplomacy and Economic Thinking. So we have here Dr. Mark Landeng. He's a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. The focus of his research is in the politics and foreign policy of China, as well as other Eastern Asian countries. Please, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much. What I'd like to do with this presentation, it's always very difficult to talk about any facet of Chinese foreign policy in 15 minutes, but I will give it my best try. I'd like to start by addressing some of the issues related to what is China's Arctic strategy, and I want to specifically talk about the role of economics. As was noted, China has yet to release a single policy paper, white paper, on the subject of the Arctic, and I will start by making a fearless prediction and saying that this will probably appear sooner rather than later, for the reason that a lot of interest in the Arctic is starting to come together in China, and because of the level of international discussion, debate about China's particular roles in the Arctic, a white paper may do much to address some of these questions. But should a white paper appear, I imagine that some of these issues might form a part of it. First of all, there's been a great emphasis, as was noted, on scientific research. China has had long-standing scientific interests in the areas of climatology, more recently climate change, glaciology, and the environment. It has maintained a research station in Spitsbergen for some time, up in Svalbard. But most of the attention now is being given towards other areas. Access to northern resources. There has been a great deal of debate in the international community about what role China might play in economic development in the region. And the other big economic issue, not a surprise at all, is the role of emerging northern sea routes. China has shown a great deal of interest in the possibility of sending exports through especially the northern sea route to markets in the west. Although, as I'm going to be pointing out shortly, this is not necessarily a fait accompli. And finally, China's recent admittance as a formal observer into the Arctic Council has also been commented on quite a bit. And it's interesting to note, especially recent discussion about headlines and how this subject has been treated. Several states received observer status, including India, Singapore, Japan, Korea, but most of the headlines focused primarily on China. It's like China's an observer in the Arctic Council. What is going to happen next? So these are the 4 issues which most often get commented on. Talking about economics, it's very important, first of all, to talk about the potential versus the actual. And in some cases, especially in some media coverage, there does tend to be a bit of confusion between the two. First of all, China, like many other non-Arctic states, is very interested in developing potential joint ventures in the north. Oil and gas is very often cited. China is still looking around for potential external sources of fossil fuels. Already there have been some high-level agreements worked out with Canada, with Russia. Greenland, as I'm going to be elaborating on very shortly, a potential trove of metals and minerals, and China is one of many states that are looking to Greenland with great interest. On the other hand, fishing, which rarely gets any headlines, but it is certainly not something to be ignored when we look at the economics of the region. And again, this is an area where China very much wants to play a role. But there's also kind of less direct issues. The question of tourism, which is a growing economic concern in China, specifically ecotourism. Iceland, Norway have been cited as potential sources there. And finally, the free trade angle, which is another area which doesn't tend to get as much press. Iceland very recently began its free trade agreement with China. There are other potential free trade agreements with Arctic countries, potentially with Canada. That's been bandied around for quite some time. Free trade talks with Norway have begun. Its endpoint, though, is, shall we say, uncertain. But I'll get back to Norway in a moment. What is also interesting is, in addition to the Arctic Council, Beijing has embarked on a series of very interesting bilateral initiatives. The free trade agreement with Iceland is very crucial here. Iceland is only the 2nd OECD country after New Zealand to sign an FTA with China. Switzerland was number 3. This puts Iceland in a very significant position when it comes to looking at how trade is going to shape China's interests in the region. With Norway, there has been an uptick of scientific cooperation. I mentioned Svalbard, also the potential for greater academic cooperation. But we have the minor issue of the diplomatic complications, shall we say, that have been in place now for coming up on 5 years. It's very unfortunate, and I'll basically say for the record that the potential for greater cooperation between the two countries could be greatly enhanced should a roadmap out of the current diplomatic impasse be found, hopefully sooner rather than later. In the case of Russia, there has been a series of high-level energy agreements culminating in the 400 billion extravaganza that was signed very recently. Very ambitious gas project. The trade deal will start to supply fossil fuel between Russia and China starting in 2019. But at the same time, China is looking for other forms of economic partnerships, not only for economic gains, which tends to get most of the press, but also for information. It is very important that China is still a newcomer in many aspects of the Arctic, not just the scientific area, but also the economic, the social, the political. There's still quite a bit of information to be had. Now, going back to Greenland. Greenland has been the subject of a great deal of debate, not only about China's economic interests in the Arctic, but also the potential for other non-Arctic states to get involved. At the end of 2013, there was a slew of articles in the European press which were, to put it delicately, bombastic, saying that China was looking at Greenland as an economic beachhead in the Arctic. There was all kinds of points to Greenland's potential mineral wealth. As you can see, it has many resources which are of great interest to several countries, non-Arctic. There's also the issue of rare earth elements. At the present, about 90 to 97% of rare earth elements, very important for green technology and electronics, are exported from China. Greenland is now seen as a secondary market, so that further added to the frenzy about what might China's response would be. yes, China has, or Chinese firms, I should say, have expressed interest in potential joint development in Greenland. Heavy accent on potential. Again, at the end of last year, there was all kinds of news stories saying that very quickly about 2,000, maybe 3,000 Chinese workers would be arriving in Greenland any minute now to start setting up mining operations, and that all kinds of laws would be bypassed, and just created a big hullabaloo, which turned out to be basically nothing, to the point where the Chinese Foreign Ministry had to put out a statement saying, no, nothing has been signed, nothing has been certified. The other big question, though, is where is Greenland's economic development going? And I'll definitely leave that to the experts and the professionals to discuss that. But there is an election coming up next month. The potential for mining in Greenland is now under a bit of question. Things could change very rapidly, or they could not change at all. Now, as for the sea routes, this is another area where China's presence has been very keenly felt. The role of the China's single icebreaker, the Zhuilong, the snow dragon, has been commented on extensively. China is in the process of constructing a second icebreaker, more modern, which was expected to be in place this year. Now it's looking more along the lines of 2015. The other ship that got quite a bit of attention very recently, the cargo vessel Yangsheng, which had the ability to traverse the Northeast Passage, Dalian to Rotterdam, in a very short amount of time, cutting 2 weeks off the usual trip through the Indian Ocean. And certainly Beijing has expressed interest in making increased use of this route once circumstances permit. How many and how long this will take, that is an open question. It should be noted, though, that there are still a lot of complications, not only for China, but for any country seeking to increase use of this route. You have still very difficult conditions, ice, weather, what have you. That leads to a lot of insurance-related complications. Professor Bales was talking about that yesterday. There's also the question of the role of Russia, which requires any ships going through require Russian permission, Russian escort, and a pretty hefty fee. So the whole idea of the route opening up for a variety of different ships, we're still talking about some point in the future. Nevertheless, China does want to be involved in this process, even though there has been, over the past 5 years or so, a lot of talk about the rebalancing of the Chinese economy, that China would start to pay less attention to relying on exports, pay more attention to domestic level economic development, including small and medium businesses within the country. The ability for China to get goods to market, to Europe, to other parts of the world, is still going to be essential in the short term. So any route designed to improve that process is of interest. We've seen all kinds of talk, for example, the Indian Ocean, the new maritime Silk Road. We've seen a great deal more attention paid to the overland trade route, the Silk Road cutting through Russia, Central Asia. So you can look at the Northern Sea Route as one example of China's great interest in opening up trade routes to Western markets. So finally, I just want to discuss a few future questions, which are going to be looked at very shortly. Will the Arctic be viewed as a future international economic concern? And if so, how? All of these areas that I've mentioned, the mining, the fossil fuels, the potential for increased shipping, this all seems to suggest that study of the Arctic will take on a much stronger economic dimension, and by association, strategic as well. If that is the case, what role will China play? There's already been some discussion about China's role within the Arctic Council, whether or not China's status as an observer will be sufficient for China to bring forth its own ideas, its own policies on Arctic development. What kind of new regimes, what kind of new rules? Everything from the Polar Code to potentially new guidelines for economic development are very likely in the near future. China is the second largest economy in the world. China is engaged in a series of cross-regional diplomacy. The Arctic is just one of the latest manifestations of this. So what role will China play in this new norm or regime building? Certainly China has accepted, I should stress, that China very much is in favor of Arctic Council guidelines. It is very much cognizant of UNCLOS rules. But there's still the gray area of what's going to happen when we see more economic activity in the region, and other countries, including non-Arctic countries, get in on the game. Will there be cooperation or competition? And that is a huge issue. Right now, China's policy definitely leans more towards cooperation because China has seen the benefits of various forms of bilateral cooperation with Denmark, with Iceland, with several Arctic states. If the economic policy becomes more zero-sum, this will place China at a very distinct disadvantage. What China does not want to see is the whole idea of the Arctic being carved up among the Arctic states themselves. This is something which China is very sensitive of. And finally, at what point will the Arctic become more economically crucial? What will be the effects, not only about the economics, but also politics, security, and the environment on China's issues? I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Next presentation is on development of the East Asia Nordic cooperation in the Arctic affairs. And we have here Dr. Michael Lushuk. He is postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of the Northern Europe countries at Jan Kochanowski University in Poland. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank you, the organizer, for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and honor to speak to such great audience. I would like to continue further presentation about the involvement of Asian countries in the Arctic. When we discuss today the problem of how East Asian states will participate in the Arctic governance as Arctic Council observers, I would like to have a step back and to take a look how did it happen that Asian states became the Arctic Council observers. And my argument here is it wouldn't be possible without cooperation with the Nordic states, and I would like to dwell a little bit about this problem. This picture here was done in beginning of May, before Greenpeace did this campaign against the LEGO and Shell cooperation, but it looks quite nice, so I let myself to use it again here. I would start with a brief description of the transformation taking place in the Arctic, about some drivers and results, which will to some extent explain why East Asian states are present in the Arctic. Then I would like to present the scope of interests. Some issues were mentioned earlier, but I would like also pay attention not only to China, but 3 other countries, so I would like to present the position here. Then I would like to focus on official statement from the Nordic states, especially for the strategies and policy documents, which will inform us how they perceived Asian states a few years ago, because the situation is a little bit dynamic, and it was before Kiruna decision, but still I think it is quite interesting to take a look to this aspect. I would like to briefly give some examples of the cooperation, indicating some strong and weak sides of this cooperation, which also gives some information how to evaluate this participation of East Asian states in the Arctic. And I will bring some conclusion. So I would like to start that transformation ongoing in the Arctic is not only about the climate change, but firstly it's about the modernization processes. And I think it's good to remember about this because these kind of processes are present in different parts of the world. They are happening with a different speed or different scope. And sooner or later they would also be present in the Arctic. And they actually made a lot of problems for not only indigenous peoples, but for all people living in the Arctic. So we should also remember about this. Other aspect is globalization, or I would say maybe internationalization of the Arctic. And this photo is a good example of this international presence in the Arctic. Arctic to some extent was international area for decades. It's not became just a few years ago, because as we listened yesterday, research is international issue, and Arctic was researched for many decades. Even from Poland perspective, we started our research 80 years ago, not 18, but 80 years ago. So the internalization of the Arctic is still a very important factor of this transformation ongoing. But of course, climate change is another aspect, and we should also think about threats and challenges because they are important not only in the Arctic region, but of course beyond it, and they have implication everywhere else in global scale. What about the results? I don't want to think about everything because it's too complex. I would like to pay attention to just 3 of them. That this transformation is rising the global, truly global interest in the region, and of course it's again has good and bad sides of this project, and we have some different aspects of this interest. Effects from this growing interest is issues which was discussed and presented yesterday, redefining or writing completely new policies and strategies sorry, in the Arctic states. The issue here is more complicated because we have a tendency to look at the Arctic as a foreign, as area for foreign policy, which is not very true because for all Arctic states, especially Arctic coastal states, many of these things are internal policy issues. And here is some kind of tension when we think about the role of observers. They cannot have the same approaches, they cannot see the same problems because they don't live in the Arctic. So this is the other aspect I would like to pay attention to. And finally, these changes make some kind of flux in the Arctic governance system. I would say that it's still under construction. Kiruna closed some period of this construction, but at the same time it's opened anew, and we have again a lot of new questions how it will look. So it's a continuity in this process, and of course it will never be finished because we will face new challenges in this aspect. But I would like to also pay attention that the changes and transformation in the Arctic in this respect is also important in terms of transformation of the whole world international system. We have non-state actors, for example, which are more and more present in the Arctic. We have spillover effects in the scope of the cooperation here. So the situation is very dynamic. Let me now briefly address the scope of the East Asian interest. Usually we focus on the main 4 areas of this interest. First of them, they are connected with climate change consequences, extreme weather situations, which, for example, influence agriculture in China. Next, we have Arctic shipping, and we have 2 different aspects of this issue, because first is shorter roads, secondly, shipping building possibilities for the East Asian countries, access to energy resources, of marine life resources, and the last but not least, I would say it's a question of international position and prestige. It was not mentioned before, but it's also, I think, very important to have in mind that some of the East Asian states already have global position, and their influence in different parts of the world is obvious for them. So how does it look in terms of specific countries? Of course, we have China, which is present in every of this area, and it was very well presented before by Mark, so I don't want to repeat. We have Japan, which is also present in this in 3 of these areas. I don't want to make any specific comment, just to compare South Korea and Singapore. As we see, to some extent, it looks that they all have the same interests. They are looking for the same opportunities in the Arctic. Is it bad or good information? I don't know. I really don't know, because it's a question to what extent they want to cooperate. I haven't seen too much, I haven't heard too much about this cooperation between East Asian states in this area. So maybe they will compete. If so, what kind of consequences it can bring for the Arctic if they start to compete? I don't know. It's a question of, as I said, of future. So now I would like to say a few words about the Nordic approaches to the East Asian involvement in the Arctic region. And as I said, I read Arctic strategies, Arctic policies, and briefly what you can find there. Let me start with Finland. Finland recognized that there is a shift in global economy, and this is the reason why Arctic East Asian states will be present in the Arctic. Finland has accomplished involvement of East Asian countries and our competencies in some areas. And of course, Finland should take advantage of its geopolitical position. So we have this very free, short information in this document. Norway is more willing to share with their position in the strategy documents about the East Asian states, but they are quite similar. They are showing that this involvement is offering new possibilities for cooperation for Norwegian companies in the East Asian markets, for example. There is something about research project, which, as we know, have been developing since a few years very well. It looks that Norway is open for this coming of East Asian states to the region. There is a lot of information, but a lot of sentences in the Danish strategy, but they are still can be summarized in three words. Yes, we recognize the presence. We are open for the discussion, for cooperation. And what is interesting, and it wasn't mentioned before, the Kingdom of Denmark is saying about the role it can play introducing the East Asian countries to the region. So since most of the strategies was published before Kiruna decision, we can see that it was obvious to some extent that Nordic countries will support the East Asian ambitions to become observers in the Arctic Council. What is interesting, I haven't found too much in the Icelandic and Swedish documents relating to this issue, which is to some point strange maybe. Why? Because when we take a look to examples of cooperations, let me start with the Iceland, because this is the best, I think, example of how influential East Asian countries can be in this cooperation with the Nordic states. And of course, this cooperation hasn't started with the icebreaker diplomacy and will not end with the free trade agreement. Actually, the negotiation started in 2006, so a few years before this Arctic cooperation has been developed. But a few agreements between China and Iceland are referring to the especially Arctic cooperation. So we can expect that it would be developed in this direction in future. Mark mentioned the problem with this diplomatic chill between China and Norway. Let me explain. I don't agree completely, because actually in 2010, when Liu Xiaobo was offered a peace prize, Nobel Peace Prize, there was completely disaster in this relations in terms of political dialogue, but also in economy. And it was very soon became obvious that China was felt offended by this decision, and this chill was obvious. But Norway did homework very well, because in May, when we have Dalai Lama in Oslo celebrating anniversary of his Nobel Prize, he was not officially met by any of the government's officials. So China was not offended this time. So it gives an example, 4 years of difference, how situation has changed. We have other examples of cooperation in terms of business cooperation. So we have Aurora, Arctic Aurora ship, LNG tanker built in Korea. It's a very good example, because first voyage did for Gazprom with Norwegian gas to Japan. So this is globalization I mentioned before. We have also Goliath platform, which is still built in the Korean shipyards. It should have been operating last year, I guess, but the plans are for next year. We have also scientific cooperation. Some of you are involved in this project, so I don't want to dwell much on this, but I think it's a very good example of showing how this cooperation between East Asian and, in this case, China and Nordic community are developed. And the last, not but least, it's obvious that this cooperation will also have a less official level, and a lot of tourists from East Asian states are coming to the Arctic, will also make a change and challenge for the region. So now I would like to make 3 simple conclusions. First, it's obvious that Arctic transformation and cooperation between Nordic and East Asian states can find a good place in this region, so it's a good opportunity. And I agree with Mark saying that as for now, these relations are to some extent going very well. But question is for how long it can last. To what extent, how soon this ambitious and interest can finish. I don't know, it's open question. And the last but not least, I think that it will have increasing impacts. And I think that Nordic and East Asian cooperation still has an important role to play in future development of the Arctic region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Then the last of the presentations this morning is on the rise of Asia in a changing Arctic, the view from Iceland, but the man comes from Singapore. Jesse Hastings, doctor, he is lecturer in the Department of Geography at the National University of Singapore. He says that he is a relative newcomer in Arctic research, but I have met this guy twice in Iceland doing research on the Arctic. So, please.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm happy to be back in Iceland. I was just here about a month ago, so went to Singapore and back again. So today, I'm going to be talking about some of the findings coming out of a research project that's still ongoing, a CAPS-funded research project entitled The Rise of Asia in a Changing Arctic, The View from Iceland. So this project takes a little bit of a different tack than what we've heard about so far. It's not so much looking at these higher level policy and nation-to-nation cooperation efforts. Instead, it's looking at the reception of the general public of one of the Arctic countries, Iceland, which I'll, of course, tell you a lot more about in the slides to come. So, since the early to mid-2000s, and especially since the 2008 financial crash, there's been an increasing interest from Icelandic political and business elites to engage with Asian governments, Asian businesses, and Asian investors. So this engagement is seen as an opportunity to strengthen diplomatic ties with rising world powers, as we just heard about, attract foreign direct investment into Iceland and revive its, in their opinion, flagging economy and enable Iceland's Arctic ambitions. For example, you may know about the look to develop oil and gas in Iceland's EEZ. This isn't going to be possible without outside capital and outside expertise. You may have heard about the transshipment hub that Iceland has talked about. Again, this development of this hub would be very difficult to do without outside capital and outside expertise. However, despite this push by Icelandic elites to develop these relationships, there's really little known about how the regular Icelander views these emerging political, economic, and scientific relationships. So knowing public opinion and the factors driving these opinions have significant policy and management implications. For example, the public reaction to the ecotourism project proposed by Chinese investor Huang Nubo in Iceland's northeast took many in the Icelandic political and business establishment by surprise. Having a better understanding of public opinion towards these relationships between Arctic countries and Asian countries could help with the management of other projects in Iceland and other Arctic countries in the future. So just very quickly about the methods for this research project. The methods basically include semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and a national survey. Semi-structured interviews are focused upon those that we feel have a responsibility to understand and channel public opinion, including trade union representatives, mayors and municipal council members around Iceland, and members of parliament. Foreign diplomats have also been interviewed to get an outsider's perspective on Icelandic society. Focus groups have been incredibly useful. Focus groups at different locations around Iceland were and are being held to hear directly from Icelanders and get their opinions through extended group discussion and debate. And there's a national survey ongoing to build that quantitative data and allow hypothesis testing. Of course, as was mentioned by Lassi, I'm not from Iceland. I don't speak Icelandic, so it's very important, of course, to have some Icelandic partners who are listed here, and one is who is in the room actually now. So I'll emphasize again that this research is still ongoing, so just consider this as a working paper. But there are some general themes that are starting to emerge. So generally speaking, both diplomatic and scientific ties with Asian countries are viewed by Icelanders either neutrally or positively. In the economic arena, trade with Asian nations is valued for several reasons, including its increased opportunities to export Icelandic products to new markets, as well as save money for consumers through purchasing at sites such as Alibaba. However, Asian financial foreign direct investment into Iceland is viewed somewhat differently, and there's a variety of reasons connected to this, which I'll expand on here. Just remember, I'm only the messenger. These aren't my opinions. So, the first thing that's very apparent doing this research is asking the question, what do you think about the relationships with Asian countries, is perhaps the wrong question. I mean, when you ask this question, asking about their support for economic engagement with Asian countries, companies, etc., most Icelanders are going to respond immediately by talking about potential economic engagement with China in particular. So China basically stands apart in the Icelandic imagination for several reasons. China, of course, is the most visible East Asian player in the Arctic, and one that naturally attracts attention due to its size and economic power. There have been Iceland-specific efforts, however, including the diplomacy by the president, the Hwang Nubo case, and of course the free trade agreement that was just talked about. It's interesting that other Asian countries besides China are not very visible in the Icelandic imagination. Either they don't really have a history of engagement in Iceland, or their engagement, as is the case with India, and investment in hotels, it's going very much under the radar. So the general attitude of Icelanders towards economic engagement with China is caution, and caution's putting it lightly. You could even say great caution. There's several reasons for this caution. First of all, there's a very low familiarity among Icelanders about Chinese culture. So China, of course, is a relative newcomer to the Arctic, to the region, and most Icelanders know very little about Chinese history, Chinese values, and Chinese people. There's no history of friendship with or travel to China, meaning that most perceptions of China are built through media reports. Secondly, there's a large suspicion of and distrust towards the Chinese government for a variety of reasons. Number one being their human rights record, the fact that it's nominally communist, and the fact that it's opaque in many of its dealings around the world. Connected to this, there's a strong suspicion of Chinese motives in Iceland and Chinese motives in the Arctic. Respondents repeatedly pointed to evidence of ulterior motives, including referencing the, in their opinion, very large size of the Chinese embassy in Iceland, the mysterious disappearance of the former Chinese ambassador, the illogical nature of China focusing on such a small country as Iceland, and repeated references to Chinese activities that are perceived as exploitative in Africa. So, of course, one last thing, Icelanders are very cognizant of the differences in size and economic power, and point to this as an obvious reason why caution is warranted. So, caution about economic relationship with China is particularly pronounced when discussing investment in particular sectors deemed sensitive, such as fisheries, land, and energy. In some respects, this is related to a general reluctance by Icelanders to have foreigners controlling native soil and natural resources. However, due to the reasons stated before, Chinese investment in these sectors is particularly opposed. Investment in these sectors is seen as a potential threat to the national sovereignty of Iceland and the beginning of a slippery slope where all of Iceland is gobbled up. This sentiment is closely related to the Icelandic national character, which values independence and freedom from foreign control. An important theme that came up many times is that scale matters. That is, small investments, for example, in one or several farms may fly under the radar, while investments in large amounts of land, such as the case with the Hwang Nubo affair, set off alarm bells and can expect significant pushback, especially if the project is seen to have ulterior motives. There's a risk in the public imagination of large acquisitions becoming even larger in people's minds. For example, the farms that Hwang Nubo wanted to buy actually only totaled 0.3% of Iceland, but many respondents would talk about it being 2 or 3% of Iceland, so 10 times larger than it actually was. Another reason for Icelandic caution is the fact that Icelanders view China as outmatching it in terms of strategic thinking. So China is seen as a nation with a culture of long-term strategic thinking, a history of 5-year plans, as you can see with this graphic. Conversely, Iceland is seen as a nation with a culture of short-term, opportunistic, reactive thinking. So this tendency towards short-term thinking in Iceland is seen as an outgrowth of the national character, or perhaps related to the small public administration and lack of capacity in the country. But regardless of the reasons, the mismatch means that Icelanders see a vulnerability in dealing with China and being taken advantage of. So one of the questions we asked was, is the Icelandic legislative framework well developed enough to protect Icelandic interests when making deals with China in Arctic and Icelandic matters? And in this question, it was very interesting to see the difference in responses between those that you could classify as political and business elites and those that would not be. So by and large, those in the former category said that yes, the legislative framework was well developed enough to protect Icelandic interests, although there was certain room for clarification and standardization in the legislation. Along these lines, they mentioned that the comparison of Iceland to African countries and the associated vulnerability to being taken advantage of was relatively groundless. However, those in the latter category, the non-elites, said no, it is not well developed enough. The issue wasn't necessarily that legislation didn't exist, it was that they saw it as being fragile in implementation and vulnerable to being altered or worked around based on personal connections and special deals. The special deals got by the aluminum smelters and energy prices was repeatedly referred to as one example. There was also references to how Iceland, again perhaps due to lack of capacity, copies and pastes legislation from other Nordic countries, meaning that legislation is perhaps not as adapted as it could be. There was also a theme that came up repeatedly, this pronounced lack of trust in the Icelandic political and business establishment to act in Iceland's interest when making deals with China. So trust in politicians in Iceland has plummeted since the financial crash and not recovered. And the Iceland-China relationship is very new versus relationships with other countries such as the Nordic states. And Icelanders are uncertain where its leaders, who are not particularly trusted for other reasons, are actually taking it. The size of China and its economic power, again, makes it seen as especially able to demand special conditions through its cultivated political connections and friendships. So when discussing differences in opinion between different geographic areas in Iceland, many people spoke of the differences between those in Reykjavík and those in more rural regions. So those in Reykjavík were seen to be more suspicious of deals with China and have more concern with issues such as the environment and human rights. While those outside of Reykjavík, especially areas suffering from depopulation and low economic growth, were seen as more enthusiastic for deals with other countries, including with China, that could bring investment and jobs. This means that for certain projects, such as what happened with Nubo, the national municipal interests can be in conflict. Those respondents more familiar with economic development patterns in Iceland mentioned a lack of coordination between national and municipal levels in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. So they said that Iceland has a habit of reacting to potential opportunities on a project-by-project basis, reactively rather than proactively, and there was relatively little coordination between the national and municipal levels and no clear long-term national strategy. So several informants mentioned that the Nubo case was this wake-up call to develop a strategy for foreign direct investment in general and for engaging with China in particular. So in summary, you can say that Icelanders, as would probably be the case in many other Arctic countries, see benefits to engaging with China as perhaps a rising Arctic power. They value the better diplomatic relationships, the ability to bring capacity to Arctic science, and the large market that China is for Icelandic products. The economic relationships with China, especially those regarding projects on Icelandic soil, are viewed much more cautiously, although there are geographic differences. So when you're talking about the paths ahead, some of the things that were mentioned to me are listed here below. Firstly, there's a need for a greater Icelandic understanding of Chinese culture, and arguably a greater Chinese understanding of Icelandic culture. So both sides suffer from a bit of ignorance characteristic of many new relationships. Efforts by academic and non-academic institutes that spread information about Chinese people and culture should be applauded and expanded. Secondly, if Icelandic leaders plan to continue to grow the Iceland-China relationship, as it seems like they do, there is an urgent need for a cross-sectoral dialogue about what the goals of this relationship are. So one that engages different governmental levels and includes the general public. Icelanders see this relationship as driven by elites and want to know where it is heading. So greater clarity on objectives may help soothe suspicion. Finally, there's a need for development of coordinated national strategy for attracting and managing foreign direct investment, including from China, engaging both the national and municipal levels in this strategic thinking. This is connected to a general need to clarify and standardize laws on foreign direct investment, removing loopholes, and removing opportunities for so-called special deals. That's it. Thank you.